Hey, this is welcome back, everybody. Thank you for your indulgence. This is session 4B in hearing stream hearing stream 2 on day 1. And we're hearing from submitter number 2, which is Greater Wellington Regional Council. Welcome, Solna. Thanks again for coming in earlier. The Greater Wellington Regional Council submissions across a number of the today have been discussed quite extensively. I understand you've been online and you would have heard some of the discussion and questions. How are you planning to structure your presentation today?
So I'll just thank you for that, Commissioner. I'll just start off by saying that my colleague Chloe Nanestead was planning to come but can no longer attend. So it's just me today. Okay. And as I mentioned, we only received the summary statements at 11 o'clock today, so I've had quite limited time to respond to those points raised in the statements. But I was listening in for some of this morning, and I will do my best to focus on outstanding matters rather than repeat myself.
Yes. So you'll note that there's been some movement on some matters, but not all.
I was planning to just provide a brief introduction and then focus on those outstanding matters. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak to my evidence on hearing stream 2 and to the reporting officers for their responses on this to date. So what I'm discussing today focuses in particular on the implementation of or consistency with the NPS on urban development and the regional policy statement, both operative and proposed. I also point quite a lot to the recently released future development strategy for the Wairarapa, Wellington and Horowhenua, which the district plan must have regard to and which provides clear direction on development priorities. So as I said, I'll take my evidence as read. I just wanted to kind of briefly provide a bit of an introduction to what I'm talking about, and that really I'm talking about opportunities to support the existing town centres, as to lock in the benefits of investment in public transport, to enhance livability for residents in the Wairarapa, and to support those residents by offering them greater access to a wider range of travel options, housing and housing prices. So really what I'm talking about is providing choice to the current and future residents of the Wairarapa towns. And that choice is about where and how they live, how they travel, and how they interact with their local town centres. I've outlined throughout my evidence the benefits of well-designed, small-scale densification within existing urban areas and how this applies to and can benefit rural towns. There's really significant potential in these towns to support the vibrancy of the town centres and to promote access to walking, cycling and public transport options. And the best way to do this in the context of this hearing stream, or one of a really effective way to do that, is to focus on concentrating development in and around the centres and around existing transport links. So I've also outlined in my evidence the many reasons to support housing variety, housing affordability and mixed-use development, and again why this is relevant to the Wairarapa towns and would really benefit them and is directed by the NPSUD and the RPS. So the future development strategy, which I've mentioned throughout my evidence, also particularly emphasises densification and development within existing towns, as well as housing variety and mixed-use development. And it recognises these as key parts of good urban design and planning. So Greater Wellington's submission, in the context of that background, I suppose, sought that the PDP could go further to enable well-designed, well-located and compact development within existing urban areas. These opportunities that I've just described are also recognised by national and regional policy, and therefore that forms the basis of the relief I'm seeking in my evidence. So as I say, that I think there's considerable regional policy support for enabling more compact typologies within the existing towns to a greater extent than the PDP currently does. I've discussed the RPS in quite a lot of detail in my evidence, but I also really want to note that the future development strategy explicitly prioritises development within existing Wairarapa towns, particularly in Featherston, Carterton and Masterton, because they're located along the train line. The future development strategy, I'm not aware that it's been addressed by the reporting officer to date. However, I maintain my view that it's highly relevant to the residential and town centre zones and how they provide for development. So both the future development strategy and Greater Wellington's submission highlight the significant planned investment that in the Wairarapa train line that's coming up over the next decade, which will see an increase in services along the Wairarapa train line. There's also an existing bus route which connects the 5 main towns to each other and is used as a commuter and off-peak service. That's the number 200. Focusing development around these existing transport links will help to lock in the benefits of investment in these transport networks. The final thing I just want to note is that Greater Wellington has released an urban design toolkit, which focuses in the last couple of months, which focuses on the opportunities for well-designed infill development and the well-being and livability benefits that are possible through various urban design and urban form interventions. The toolkit is intended to demonstrate the benefits of compact development and how holistic design approaches can be achieved. I've just pre-circulated some slides that I had, some very brief slides that I'd pulled together. I'll just pull it up now.
While you're doing that, we're just having that circulated in hard copy.
Oh, okay. In that case, refer to slide 1, which just has an excerpt from that toolkit.
Okay.
Sorry, those slides aren't really labeled because I was just planning to talk to them as I went. That's just to give you an example of the kind of thing that's in that toolkit. So that's a bit of a general introduction, and then I was just going to turn to particularly the outstanding matters on my evidence, the things that were covered in my evidence, which was quite a lot of topics across this hearing stream.
Just before you do, before you move on to the subject, I might have some generic questions for you. I'll just check.
Yeah.
Councillor Plummer.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Zola. You probably heard some of the questions I asked earlier about the impact of intensification, and you use intensification quite a lot in your statement of evidence there. And I'm just really interested, and the pictures you've given and in your evidence, I think it was the photos on figure 4. You had some towns. Yeah, I'm really interested as to what evidence there is. And you use the term holistic in theory a lot. And I'm really interested in what evidence there is that intensification of a small rural town is going to enhance livability to the extent that it won't have a detrimental effect on the very reason why people go to live in a small rural town. Have you got some evidence of where this has been? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that's developing. It's kind of in some ways too early to tell. We don't have a lot of examples of this happening in New Zealand towns in particular. I will note that there are several smaller rural towns that are starting to see multi-unit development, like became aware of Ashburton has got some development up to about 4 stories in its centre, which is really apparently quite positively seen by the community.
Ashburton is not.
I mean, that's fully anecdotal, so I can't point to evidence. I will point to, in my evidence, I referred to research that was done by the Outdoor Access Commission that talks specifically about walkability.
Sorry, if I could just stop you there. Sorry, when you use Ashburton, I'm not sure of the population of Ashburton, 10,000 people? Perhaps, maybe more? More?
I just drove through it yesterday.
That is not a small rural town of 3,000 people like Greytown or Martinborough or Featherston. So if you want to give me an example, think something a third of the size of Ashburton, where your evidence might be able to persuade me to say intensification is a good thing, as opposed to something where people would go, I don't want to be living right next to my neighbour because I've come here for the rural environment.
Yeah, I will say when I refer to Ashburton, I'm probably comparing it to the size of Masterton, which it would be probably similar. So yeah, I agree. We're talking about Masterton and then also smaller towns in the Wairarapa. Yeah, I can't point to specific evidence. Unfortunately, I'm not an urban designer who can refer to. I'm not aware of a huge amount of examples in this country because it's a very recent thing that we've started to point to compact urban form and to recognise the benefits of compact urban form. I mean, I think the benefits have been known for quite some time, but it's been probably in the last few years that that's picked up a bit more. I think we can look overseas and see small rural towns that do have higher densities, around 2 to 3 stories in rural areas, and have maintained a very compact urban form and haven't sprawled. And there are several examples of that, but
Can you give me one?
I can't talk to it.
Could you give me one?
Just basically any small town in France. For example, you know, like they tend to kind of have 2 to 3 stories in their small rural towns, and then have very compact walkable footprints. So no, I can't give you a specific town.
I'm struggling to really understand what you're trying to say to us here, that intensification is a good thing based on what, France? Well, you know,
it is.
We can't have 3-story buildings. We've determined that 2 stories in Greytown and Featherston and Martinborough and Carterton is it. We're not talking about high rise. We're not talking about towns that have cobblestone streets. We're talking about very rural farming districts where as I suppose as councillors, what we hear non-stop is everybody comes to these towns because they love the smallness and the rural vibe. What you're telling us here is that you think that the opposite should be occurring, and that will be good for the town.
No, I don't think that's what I'm saying. I think I'm saying that, well, what I am saying is that intensification is not incompatible with rural character and rural vibes, and it can actually be really good for the town centre by giving people who live in the towns, because we're talking about the towns of the Wairarapa, particularly close to the centre, look the same as a lot of suburban parts of this country, and they struggle with the same issues around car dependency, lack of housing variety, lack of choice for people who want to downsize, where there are only 4-bedroom or 3-bedroom detached dwellings available to them if they want to downsize. And so providing that choice to the people that live here, who still be able to live close to the centre, to be able to walk into the town centre, but without changing the rural character of the town, because it's actually retaining the rural character of the town by consolidating where the development is happening to be very central and to where people can access services and amenities. So they're not compatible. I'm not suggesting that these towns are going to become super urbanized and feel super urban. We're talking about like terraced housing, which is a really great form of development for people wanting to downsize or for small families. But it can be done in a way that doesn't feel super urbanized.
You've just said that there's a demand for downsizing and there's a demand for smaller things. What's your evidence of that in the Wairarapa?
Both the South Wairarapa and Carterton, the South Wairarapa Spatial Plan discusses the need for housing variety and choice and greater affordability. Also, the Carterton Housing Action Plan, which was released in 2021, specifically identifies the community's desire for greater housing variety and for more affordable housing options.
How's a four-story building?
and particularly downsizing options as well.
Ms. Solner, those spatial plans also identified potential greenfield areas that have been rezoned, zoned FUZ, Future Urban Development Zone, in the plan. And we had quite a discussion with the officers today about the role of those spatial plans in informing the district plan, and the district plan being a mechanism to give effect to at least one aspect of the spatial plan, which was a desire to have some greenfield developments to enable the choice that you referred to earlier in housing type and location. What's your response to that? Is that something we need to take on board also?
So, sorry, so you're saying that the greenfield development is also providing housing variety and choice?
In terms of the total package that's available to,
Yeah.
And that we've heard from 2 or 3 of the officers today, particularly Ms. Robertson, emphasising how much importance the spatial plans, what the importance of the spatial plans in identifying those FUZ areas.
Yeah. Yes, no, I don't disagree with that view. I think there's many kinds of development that provide for housing choice and variety. There are particular kinds of development that haven't historically happened that provide for particular kinds of housing variety that would be great to see more of to give better effect to the RPS. And that is more compact and higher density typologies like terraced housing or smaller units, smaller lot sizes.
Yeah, but surely
and that can happen through intensification and through greenfield development. So greenfield development can also provide that.
No, thank you for that acknowledgement. I just wondered how that sat with the Greater Wellington's general submission seeking either the removal or reduction of the FUZ zones throughout the main districts. Is that something that you now want to reflect on?
Yeah, I was going to comment on that a little bit later, but I can come to that now. I mean, I recognise what the reporting officer is saying about the fact that these zones are a holding zone and basically need to undergo further assessment later once the process of live zoning them commences. I particularly support what the reporting officer was saying in relation to the Carterton East structure plan, that there are next steps for this area, and that in that plan change process there'll need to be consideration of existing development capacity that might already be enabled. I guess to provide some context for where those submissions come from, as soon as a section or a piece of land is identified as or signalled for future urban development, it can create an expectation that urban development is inevitable there. And I've seen this play out in some plan change processes, and just in my experience, this can happen, that there can be an expectation created. While this is in best practice situations not going to be the case, and I totally acknowledge what the reporting officer is saying, that there should be full assessment at the time of actually zoning this land, it can be difficult later in the process to ask the fundamental question of, do we need this additional land to best achieve what we're trying to achieve for this town? And do we, given the development capacity we have, do we need this additional land? And that comes in the context of the fact that the regional policy statement is quite clearly seeking a compact urban form, and it's seeking essentially to try to keep the rural land as rural land where possible. And in particular, it has direction on productive soils, on LUC classes 1 and 2 soils. And so in this context, I guess it's worth asking the question now of is this land needed now? And so I guess that's in my view, now is the most appropriate, effective and efficient time to ask that question, because it can become harder to ask that question later down the line.
But if the answer now is there's a likelihood that the land's needed, doesn't the FUZ play a role in at least safeguarding that option for future investigation at a later stage without necessarily locking it in to a residential use.
Yes. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think if one can trust that process might happen later on, then yes, I appreciate. And yeah, I was going to say that I basically accept the response that these areas will be tested in greater detail at later stages. I just wanted to explain the context for that submission that
Yes.
Greater Wellington's pointing out that there is operative RPS direction on LUC classes 1 and 2 land, and that a lot of that area around Martinborough and Greytown is LUC class 1 and 2 land, which is a finite resource. And we just want to really point out that is, yeah.
Ms.
Market
Sola,
Gardens used. Oh, sorry.
could I just tease that out a little bit further? Councils for a long time have been criticised about not making enough land available for development, which has been argued has given significant rise to the cost of housing. Here we are doing that exact thing, and now the regional council are saying don't do that thing, and yet part of your submission is housing affordability. Well, provide the provision of land or the indication of future land for future potential growth as part of that requirement to keep housing pricing affordable.
Can I just elaborate a little bit on, I think Greater Wellington's submission didn't say don't do that thing. Greater Wellington's submission said don't do that thing in the context that we think you've got greater capacity to enable intensification in the existing urban zones. So it's about the balance. It's about have you tried to provide for some of that development capacity in the existing urban zones? Yes, there is definitely some. And therefore, I suppose it's like, do we need all of that greenfield land now to signal it now if there is still potentially development capacity in the existing urban zones that hasn't been enabled? So it's the constraints on housing affordability come from both constraining intensification in existing urban zones and also not enabling enough land for greenfield development. And so I don't think Greater Wellington's submission is saying don't do greenfield development. It's saying let's just make sure that on balance there's been tests on where there is potential development capacity that could be enabled.
And
however, as I've said, I accept the reporting officer's view that there will be further assessment of these areas. They've just been signalled through the future urban zone. They're a holding zone, so I accept that. You
don't consider the plan strikes a balance between intensification and take the South Wairarapa spatial plan, for example, and use Featherston, where there is the approval to go down to smaller lot sizes in the central part of Featherston, and yet still providing some greenfields land on the outskirts of Featherston, given that not everybody wants to live in the centre of town. So the spatial plan is therefore trying to strike a balance between exactly what you're saying. Do you consider that the balance is wrong or not there?
I think just in the context, and I'll come to this with the low density precinct. I think what I was saying in terms of the low density precinct with Greytown and Martinborough is that because a low density precinct has been applied across the whole towns of Greytown and Martinborough, in that instance, I don't think the balance has been struck, because you're basically saying we don't want to see further development. You're sending a signal that we don't want to see further development or higher densities, at least, within the existing towns. However, we do think we need all of this additional land. And so just in the context of the productive soils that sit around those towns, in that case, I don't think that the balance has been struck. And that's what my evidence tries to tease out a little bit more.
Okay.
Thank you.
You carry on then in terms of your outline of your evidence.
So, sorry, I'll just go back to. So I'll just firstly mention that I strongly support where the officer has made recommendations I'll start with the residential zones because that's probably the biggest. I strongly support the recommendations made by the officer, in particular adding the medium density residential precinct to Featherston in alignment with the master plan, and some amendments to reflect transport outcomes in those provisions. I also strongly support what has been changed in the hearing summary statement, what's been recommended to be changed in the hearing summary statements for some of those provisions. Just want to briefly, so slide 2 of my slides just briefly talks to a comment that was made about scope of Greater Wellington's submission on GRZ R10. I think there looks like this is highlighted that there might be an error in how the submissions were summarized. I've just shown in that slide, Greater Wellington's original submission had a submission applying to all of the rules and standards in the general residential zone. But it looks like in the summary of submissions that was assigned to GRZ R1. So I just wanted to flag that I think in terms of scope that there is probably, in my view, probably scope because that applied to all rules and standards. So I'll just move on to the low density residential precinct. So currently the low density residential precinct applies to the entire towns of Greytown and Martinborough. And the way that the rules are set up, this sends a signal that higher densities are not supported across these entire towns. And originally, if you exceeded the permitted density, it would have been a non-complying activity. However, the reporting officer has now suggested that that's amended to discretionary activity, which I support. So my evidence focuses on the intent of this low density residential precinct and specifically which effects it's seeking to manage under the Resource Management Act. It's justified in a few different ways as managing character, amenity, heritage, and infrastructure constraints. And the reporting officer states that because heritage and character values have been identified through the South Wide Upper Spatial Plan, a precautionary approach to protecting the potential values should be taken. So I don't disagree that there's a need to protect heritage values, and I totally agree that the RPS provides direction on historic heritage, which I discuss in my evidence. However, I've talked through in my evidence that this has already been achieved through identification of heritage precincts in these towns, and this happens through the historic heritage chapter, which have specific rules applying protections for heritage values. So, for example, on slide 3 of my slides, you can see that Greytown has an identified heritage precinct, which covers most of the main street. And then there are specific scheduled buildings throughout the town. You can see that the area for the low density residential precinct is much larger and applies to the whole town and overlaps with that heritage precinct. So I guess the question I'm asking in my evidence is, what specifically is that broader area doing or protecting? Like what is it doing that the district plan isn't already doing? So and just briefly on heritage, in paragraph 66 of my evidence, I've listed out there's quite a lot of objectives, policies, and rules which specifically protect the heritage values in that heritage precinct of Greytown, and there's another one in Martinborough, from subdivision use and development. And I think that kind of achieves the RPS's direction on historic heritage. So on top of outside of heritage, there's also extensive policies, objectives, and rules in the general residential zone chapter which protect character and amenity. It hasn't been made clear to me yet why the existing district plan provisions on heritage, character, and amenity are insufficient in these wider areas for Greytown and Martinborough, and therefore why broader additional limitations on density are necessary in these towns. So in response to the reporting officer seeking to take a precautionary approach to character, which is, I think, something that was mentioned this morning, until there's more detailed information, I also think, that you could take a precautionary approach for a lot of things, including potentially housing affordability and variety. And so I don't necessarily agree with that view that a precautionary approach is needed in this case, considering the fact that heritage values have been protected.
Could I just stop you there for a minute?
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that you're raising here were discussed and submitted on as part of the spatial planning process that was done in South Wairarapa, and I can only talk South Wairarapa here, in the long hearings that we had over many months in Exton, Martinborough and Greytown. Do you know if Greater Wellington Regional Council submitted on any of those or attended any of those hearings?
I know that this was before my time. I know that Greater Wellington provided some high-level feedback through an email in October 2019. However, I'm not sure what happened after that. I think there might have been limited engagement because of resourcing. So, but I can give you an overview of what was covered in that feedback. So it sought to clarify what the purpose of the spatial plan was, and it sought clarity on how it might feed into the district plan. It also highlighted the RPS, and that it might be useful direction to inform the spatial plan. And it also questioned, it highlighted the Wellington Regional Growth Framework also, and it questioned some of the planned development on the edges of the towns and kind of raised the productive soils point. However, I'm sorry, I can't elaborate on any further engagement that happened.
Do you know whether that engagement that you did have, did you get Greater Wellington get any feedback on that process and whether any of those suggestions were taken into consideration?
Sorry, no, I don't know. It was before my time.
Would you agree that that was probably the more appropriate place to have these conversations, given that they're sort of that's when the real detail of what you're talking about now was nutted out and with the community involved in a very long and detailed process over, I think well over 2 years, wasn't it?
Yes, I agree with that, absolutely. But I also think the spatial plan is one thing that informs the district plan. A district plan must have regard to a spatial plan. And this was kind of something that Greater Wellington, in its feedback on the spatial plan, sought a bit more clarity on, is exactly how was that going to flow into the district plan. I suppose that the regional policy statement must be given effect to in the district plan. So there is other direction that needs to be brought in through the district plan on top of the spatial plan. And I kind of make that point in my evidence that yes, it feeds in, but it's not the only time for those conversations to be had. There still needs to be other inputs into these considerations, which includes what is in the regional policy statement.
Thank you.
Can I just clarify a comment that you've made? It's the last sentence of your paragraph 75. And you state, I will also highlight that the future development strategy, which represents a more recent spatial plan for the whole region, must also be had regard to, specifically identifies growth in existing rural areas as one of the 5 prioritised areas for development. Are you aware that for example, the Carterton Eastern Growth Strategy actually fed into that? And I mean, I sat on the hearings for those, and a lot of what is reflected in our PDP actually was what is part of that anyway. But it almost, the way I'm reading that, it's almost as if you're saying that what we have got in there doesn't highlight, where in fact it's actually what's informed the FDS.
No, I definitely don't mean that. I totally acknowledge that the future development strategy, that there is already lots of good alignment. The point I'm just making is that the future development strategy has identified 5 priority areas for development, and one of those is development within existing rural towns, particularly those rural towns located along train lines. And so I'm just kind of making the point that there's support there for providing for higher densities and intensification in the existing urban towns. So I'm not saying that they're not consistent with each other at all. And I acknowledge that and I think the Greater Wellington submission does recognise that the Carterton East structure plan is identified in the future development strategy. Oh, sorry, that area is identified in the future development strategy as a priority development area.
I think
I'm just conscious of time. So we've got Kiwi Rail in 15 minutes. I just want to tailor the rest of your presentation to reflect that time.
Yeah, I'm pretty much finished with low density. I think, I guess my final comment just on this, I'm mostly in my evidence and focusing on the opportunities of, I guess, being less restrictive on potential for intensification where it's well designed and where it's going to deliver good outcomes. And I think the residential design guide has really good direction in it, and it has sufficient oversight over the kind of development that is going to potentially happen, that we can be confident that it's likely to have good outcomes, and be well designed and contribute effectively to the existing surrounding context, and be done in a very sensitive way. So I feel in the context of that confidence from the design guide and the existing protections that are there, I guess I'm seeking that we don't unnecessarily restrict the potential for intensification going forward, given that this district plan is going to be around for the next decade, and so should take it should take a long-term view for how we enable development capacity in the future. So I guess in the context of the low density residential precinct, it's not clear to me why a blanket approach across those towns is needed at this point. I've kind of outlined the reasons why I think the things that it is trying to control are already very well managed by the district plan. And I suppose that's where there's a difference between the spatial plan and its direction and the broader context of the district plan and all the things that it's already doing around infrastructure, character, amenity, and heritage. So I'll just briefly move on to the medium density residential precinct. Greater Wellington submission sought that this area was extended to Featherston, Masterton, and further areas Featherston, Carterton, and further areas in Masterton in appropriate places. And this is something that Greater Wellington has consistently sought since our feedback on the draft district plan, given the opportunities for transport connectivity and housing variety that are associated with a medium density precinct. And so I will just briefly comment that in Masterton, my evidence also points out that most of the area that's currently identified is in a low hazard flood overlay. So in practice, that will provide some low level restrictions on development in that area. So the reporting officer has stated that she doesn't recommend any future areas that be identified as medium density residential precinct without there being a more detailed assessment through a spatial planning process. So I guess with respect, I support the role of spatial planning, and I absolutely think it is really important. However, a district plan review process is also a really good opportunity to undertake such an assessment to identify and enable suitable locations for higher densities. A spatial plan is not a prerequisite to identifying suitable locations for enabling higher densities. And I'll just, I guess, highlight that the district plan has identified some new greenfield development areas, and I don't see why it can't do the same for intensification. On slides 4 and 5 of my the slides that I sent through, I've just included the operative RPS policy 1, which the district plan must give effect to, which just basically says district plans need to identify sites suitable for higher densities and mixed use development, and then encourage higher densities and mixed use development in those locations. In proposed RPS change 1, policy 31 has stronger direction, which is on slide 5. And it seeks that intensification is enabled in areas identified as having good access to public and active transport or where there's relative demand. And this direction applies to the Wairarapa councils. So I guess I haven't yet seen an assessment in the Section 32 report or the Section 42A report, or in response to my evidence. I haven't seen, I guess, an assessment of whether these areas are, or which areas might be potentially suitable for higher densities. And so therefore, I still don't agree with the reporting officer's view on this matter. And I maintain that the district plans should identify further suitable areas as part of this review, as part of giving effect to RPS policy 31. And so I'll just briefly add in relation to Carterton. I've highlighted in my evidence the 2021 Carterton Housing Action Plan, which has fed into the combined district plan, which specifically identifies a community interest in greater housing choice and access to greater housing variety. I support the fact that some of the low density areas in South Carterton have been removed. However, I think there's a difference between that and actually enabling some higher densities closer to the town centre or around the train station. So in my view, identifying a medium density residential precinct in the central parts of Carterton with walking access to both the train station and the town centre would respond to this demonstrated need and community interest. I've suggested a potential area which I consider meets the criteria in policy 5, which is pretty conservative application of those criteria. Meets criteria in policy 5 of the NPCD and 31 of the RPS. And I think it's a pretty conservative estimate because I've just identified those areas that are within 5 minutes walk of both the town centre and the train station. So that's all on residential zones, and I'll just very briefly cover town centre zones. I support what the officer has recommended for TCZ01. And I also support the removal of the wording on the new clause F that had been suggested as being added. However, I still consider that something is necessary in TCZ P3 to support the potentially higher densities in centre zones. So I note that the reporting officer suggested had put forward some suggested wording, which I have just suggested some tweaks to strengthen a little bit. I'll include those in my speaking notes. I maintain my view, essentially, that the NPCD and the RPS both clearly relate to seeing intensification and mixed-use development, both within and around the centres. And I'll also point out that the reporting officer mentioned... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you for a minute? And we're getting close to the end, I suppose, but earlier you would have heard me raise the issue of reverse sensitivities in our town centres. And when you're talking about very small rural towns where the town centre is probably 100 metres long, the intensification of having more residential areas in that town centre may have the exact opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve. And I use the sale and supply of alcohol legislation as a prime example about how when you move residential people into a town centre, that piece of legislation takes priority over everything else you're trying to achieve in terms of noise and behaviours and so on. So, just could you make a comment about saying, if you were to use Greytown as an example, if you were to intensify residential dwellings in the town centre in Greytown, what the effect could be on the restaurants and the 2 pubs in that town if you have more people living there, and how you would manage that reverse sensitivity.
I think the town centre zone provisions already have quite a lot of direction on reverse sensitivity and compatibility of land uses being together. I absolutely acknowledge that it's an issue and something that needs to be managed. However, I think that the provisions at the moment do that. There's quite a lot of
Okay, I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure you're quite picking up what I'm saying. The Act, for example, the sale and supply of alcohol legislation trumps our district plan in terms of behaviours. So if you put more people living where there is entertainment through restaurants and pubs and things in the town centre, you could have the exact opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve in terms of vitalising the town centre. Could you comment on that?
So, sorry, so you're saying that there's some other legislation that the district plan can't control or that it can't influence, like the sale and distribution of alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I know enough, sorry, to comment on that. I think mixed use development is something that the regional policy statement and the NPSUD are supportive of, and it's mostly to do with the benefits that you get from more people living where they can access services, where they can walk to services and public transport. Those benefits, I suppose, always need to be weighed up against potential risks, and that's why we do these processes to work through that. I was focusing quite a lot on the potential benefits and how recognised they are.
You have something done?
Okay.
Oh, you're going to do my wetlands walkway.
So we can.
Ms. Zollner, one of the ways that you might be able to assist the panel with this, and I think you've already identified it, is getting together with, I think, Ms. Falloon in relation to clause F of TCZP3 and having a look at how that policy might be able to be adapted to reflect that issue, so that when there are applications being considered, this concept of reverse sensitivity can be considered in the round.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I accept, basically in response to that statement, I accept if the reporting officer doesn't think it's appropriate to amend the rule, and I accept that reasoning, and in that context, I'm happy to work on just some policy direction and I essentially agree with what the reporting officer has done. I've just got some minor wording tweaks.
Yes. We'll leave that to you and Ms. Falloon to get together offline, and we'll ask Ms. Falloon to capture that in her write a reply, and you can also do the same in your submission of your speaking notes. Okay. Just before you go ahead, I just acknowledge the attendance of Kiwi Rail, Michelle and Kath. Welcome. We're running slightly behind time, but we'll be with you shortly.
I was just going to say that's everything I had to cover, so I'm happy to take any other questions.
No, probably done.
No, great. I've got one question for you, and it's fairly factual. The future development strategy, what's its status currently? Sorry, you're on mute, Ms. Zollner.
Sorry. My understanding was that it was adopted in April of this year, or possibly May. I'll just have to double check.
19th of March.
19th of March. Okay, and is that what geographical area does that cover?
It covers Wairarapa, Wellington, and Horowhenua.
Okay.
And I will just briefly point out that there's in the NPSUD, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to quickly find the right clause. It in 3.17, it must be had regard to in when preparing or changing RMA planning documents. That applies to tier 1 and 2 territorial authorities. However, it says that I can't remember exactly which, and I think I mentioned it in my evidence, where it applies to a Tier 3 territorial authority, they also need to have regard to it.
Okay. So that's a specific reference in the MPSUD. Okay. And in terms of section 76, presumably it's another plan or strategy that the panel can have regard to.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Thank you. That was all from me. Being that, thank you for your presentation. Please get in touch with Ms. Falloon and see if you can't resolve clause F. And in terms of the time frame, we'd like to have your speaking notes finalised mid next week if we could.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. Okay, thanks again for your attendance.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Gunnell.
Good afternoon. Tēnā koutou katoa. As you'll no doubt know, I'm appearing as legal counsel for Kia Rail Holdings Limited today. And I guess just firstly, a big thank you for us for accommodating the Kia Rail presentation online. We really do appreciate it, given the number of plan processes Kia Rail does appear in. And so I just want to introduce my two witnesses. So firstly is Michelle Grinlerton-Hancock, who is manager of the RMA team at Kia Rail, and Catherine Hepplethwaite, who is providing expert planning evidence on behalf of Kia Rail. My very short legal submissions were pre-circulated, and so I just propose to make a few short introductory remarks and then pass on to Michelle and Kath to go through why Kia Rail is here today.
Just thank you. Just before you do, just indulge me for 30 seconds while I just grab those legal submissions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. So the key issue that the Kia Rail team wishes to present on today relates to setbacks from the rail corridor. And as will be clear from the provision set out in attachment A to Ms. Hepplethwaite's evidence, Kia Rail is seeking a 5-metre safety setback for buildings and structures from that rail corridor boundary. In all zones that are subject of the hearing today, and all zones adjoining the rail corridor, except for that natural open space zone where, in light of the location and the topography, Ms. Hepplethwaite has recommended 4 metres, which Kia Rail will adopt. Ms. Grinlerton-Hancock will provide further detail, but we just really want to reiterate the purpose of the rail setback control. It's not a reverse sensitivity control that Kia Rail will present on when we get to the noise provisions in the district-wide section of the plan. This is a safety control, and the intent is to avoid health and safety issues caused by people entering the rail corridor because they don't have enough space on their own properties. And then it has the corresponding benefit for the rail corridor, where it mitigates against incursions into that rail corridor that might disrupt or affect the Kia Rail's operations, and also potentially cause a safety issue for Kia Rail workers and train drivers and passengers on those trains. So it's kind of a dual purpose control. And I guess just from a legal perspective, in my submission, that entirely accords with the council's obligation to enable development to maintain safely and lawfully adjacent to the rail corridor under section 74(1)(b), having regard to that purpose of the RMA to enable people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural wellbeing and their health and safety. So that was actually all I proposed to open with, because we've been finding that Ms. Grinlerton-Hancock and I tend to duplicate if I talk to you about heavy freight trains and how dangerous they are. So I will leave it to Michelle from Kia Rail to sort of go through those rail specifics.
Thank you, Ms. Gunnell. Just before we hear from Ms. Grinlerton-Hancock, what I can say is that the matter of setbacks from the rail corridor has probably dominated proceedings today. We've heard from 4 different officers on the matter, spread amongst their different zones. It appears that that the contest is limited primarily to the residential zone and the FUZ zone, perhaps.
Okay.
Largely, the officers have recommended to the panel the adoption of a 5 metre setback in the town centre zone, the mixed use zone, general and industrial zone, and I think the open space zone, with the exception of the 4 metres in the natural open space zone. So in the residential zone, though Ms Wheatley has recommended rejection of that and reliance on the height in relation to boundary rules. And I think Ms Robertson has done the same in terms of the FUZ zone. I think I've accurately summarised that. It's been a long day.
Yeah, and a Monday too. And thank you, Sarah. And I do apologise on behalf of Key-Rail because none of the 3 of us were able to watch online today, and so really appreciate that update, and to the extent there is anything that we can take away and consider and come back, we'd obviously be very happy to do so.
Yeah, okay. So that's, well, I guess what I don't really want to invite any further discussion on the areas where there's already been an acceptance of the relief sought by Kiwi Rail.
Excellent, and completely understood. So in that case, I'm wondering, because Michelle's I guess summary of her evidence is just telling you how great rail is and how much it's needed for the region and the district, and she's got some figures and stats on traffic on the Wairarapa line, both in terms of the commuter and the forestry. So I guess perhaps we might divert straight to questions if the panel does have any on anything along those lines. Otherwise, it might be best to go to Ms Hebblethwaite, who can discuss the specifics of the residential and FUZ provisions.
Okay, well, we're in your hands. I don't want to reduce Michelle's presentation to any great extent, and it may be that the panel have some questions. We've heard some interesting information from the previous witness from Greater Wellington on the importance of the line and the particularly from a commuter passenger point of view, and the proposed changes that are planned to that over the next 5 to 10 years. So if you can corroborate though, that would be of interest also, I imagine. So over to you, Ms Grinlington Hancock, and you just tell us what you think we need to know.
Thank you very much. I will definitely abbreviate what I was going to be saying. So looking at the current train schedules, we have 10 trains a day, which are commuter trains, running Monday to Friday, and then there's 6 commuter trains that run over weekends. Those are commonly known as the metro trains. Then in addition to that, there are 3 freight trains a day, and those primarily run weekdays. I can confirm that the government has allocated approximately $870 million for the upgrade for the Wellington Metro upgrade program, which does include the Wairarapa line. And so part of that is the purchase of the diesel hybrid engines, and part of the purpose of doing that, as well as a number of bridge upgrades and line upgrades, is to double the amount of peak time trains from the Wairarapa into Wellington. So I can confirm that those are all things that are in progress. I currently have a list of 4 pages of projects that our Wellington Metro team would like delivered this financial year in order to support that growth in the Wairarapa line for when those trains come. So that includes some bridge replacements, an additional passing loop, and a few other bits and pieces as well. And there is also line upgrades in terms of replacement of ballast and formation and railway sleepers. So we've been going through an extensive program of replacing wooden railway sleepers with concrete ones, which increases the longevity of the line and improves speed performance. And as you will have probably seen in stuff and on other places, there are level crossing upgrades which form a part of that project, which are generating a lot of discussion at the moment, because if you are going to increase frequency of trains, then the less number of level crossings that you've got helps with that speed of getting services through. So, but yeah.
That's very useful. What I take from that is more activity and perhaps faster activity.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Well, that's a nice segue into the issue. I'll just check if there were any further questions of you. Appears not, so I think we probably can go to Ms. Heppelthwaite now. Welcome, Ms. Heppelthwaite. Thank you for your evidence in chief.
Thank you. Good afternoon, panel. And again, thank you for the update from the staff this morning and today, which we haven't had the opportunity to look at. I will take your lead and focus my comments primarily on the residential zone, which I've just had a quick look at while Ms. Gridlington-Henlott was speaking. I would, if you were able, and if not, I'll provide some commentary, and I'd be interested to understand the reason why the 5 metre setback was not favoured by Ms. Wheatley in the residential zone. The reason for my question is, if I could direct you please to, goodness, what page number is it? My primary statement, and yes, right at the back, there is a report attached to the section 32. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to look for a page number here. Why can I not find that? Actually, might be easier to go. If I may direct you to my section 32 analysis, which is attachment A to my evidence.
Yes.
In there, you'll find as figure 1.
Yes.
That is a diagram. Now that
yes,
diagram is taken from Ms. Galvin's technical assessment,
yes,
which
on the top of page 12 in my copy.
Lovely. Thank you very much, sir. That is helpful. The second to the right diagram has got a blue box, which is representative of a 9.5 metre building. I just had a very brief look at the residential controls, general residential, and the maximum height is 10 metres. So that would be a fairly similar control or similar height building to what's reflected in the second to right hand diagram there. You'll see the others, if it's of help, you've got two 12 metre buildings, a 9.5 and a 6.5. Hopefully you're following along.
Yes.
For the 9.5 metre building, you'll see Ms. Galvin's diagram has also got a recession plane there, and that is the 4 metre and 60 degree recession plane. That's from the MDRS standards. That's what Ms. Galvin's work was based on. Now, the height to boundary standard for the general residential zone, I understand, is notified at 3 metres 45. So that will be slightly lower, both in terms of the height and also the angle, because the angle is 60 degrees versus general residential, which is 45. So the building would be, the 9.5 metre building you see in my diagram would be a little further away from the boundary than what is represented in the diagram, simply because the height to boundary would push that back. That still leaves the building in a position, if it's built in accordance with the general residential zone controls, the 10 metres in the height and the 3 metres 45, in a position of needing, shall I say, more than the yard requirement to operate scaffolding and other maintenance activities, and it still leaves it in a position where items could drop and fall on the railway track. So would have been, if Ms. Wheatley gave a specific reason why she thought a building could be within the 5 metres, I would be
Yes.
very keen to hear that. If she hasn't, that's fine. I just draw your attention that that diagram and that the approximation of a similar building would still need a fairly decent setback. Ms. Galvin's got there between 5.3 and 5.6 metres. Obviously, that with the height to boundary control, which is more lenient than what the general residential zone shows. That's the best I've got, just on the basis of what we've heard today.
Sure. And look, I understand you're responding on the hoof, so somewhat, and I'm going to provide some opportunity to enable some further discussion between yourself and Ms. Wheatley in this instance. But just for the record, Ms. Wheatley's summary statement deals with this at paragraphs 40 through to 44.
Thank you.
She does replicate the right-hand side of figure 1.
Excellent.
And she does acknowledge that there's some residual risk posed by the potential for falling objects as a result of this slightly smaller setback, as a result of the height in relation to building plan. But I think rather than try and resolve this contest in this forum, I'm going to invite yourself and Ms. Wheatley to get together to on a without prejudice basis to your positions, to see whether there's any further agreement that could be undertaken in relation to the residential zone.
Yes, sir. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes. The what I would say is the starting point from all of the other officers in the other zones has been to see whether they could apply the same approach. And because of the height permitted in those zones, that approach largely failed. And that's why the setback was adopted. The lower permissible height in the residential zone was one of the reasons that Ms. Wheatley found that the height in relation to building was potentially appropriate. I believe that, yep, and she's nodding. So can I leave that with you and her? Ms. Wheatley will need to respond back to us within 15 working days of the close of the hearing. But certainly and I know you've got other responsibilities, but between now and the end of next week, I think it would be useful if you could get together with Ms. Wheatley and see whether you can nut it out. If you can't, that's fine. We have your evidence and we have her evidence, and we'll have to make a decision. So, but if you can assist us in that, that would be useful.
Yes, sir. I'll endeavour to ensure that happens by the end of next week.
Yes. Was there any, apart from that, were there any other matters that are still outstanding from your perspective?
No, sir. I think my evidence is probably fairly self-explanatory, and it's I think the council planners for considering it and taking that into account when they've come to their conclusions on the other zones.
I just add that in relation to the FUZ zone, Ms. Robertson was the author. No, the FUZ zone doesn't adjoin any rail corridor currently. If it is upzoned in the fullness of time, to say a residential zone or a mixed-use zone or whatever, then it'll take on whatever provisions that apply to that zone. So I don't think you need to worry about the FUZ zone in your discussions with the council.
Right, noted, sir. Thank you.
That's a question. Just when we're looking at ZS3, there are exceptions to the rule, which is eaves, porches, balconies, decks, swimming pools, those sorts of that. I presume those exemptions are still going to be. You're not asking us to overturn those exemptions within the 5 metre rule, eh? Or are you saying 5 metres for everything?
The rule, I think, relates to buildings. One moment, please. That matter wasn't specifically addressed in Kerrell's submission, but I'm just going to check.
Buildings and structures, separately.
Buildings and structures. Thank you.
But if you have a look in the rules, there are some exemptions. If you could just clarify those as part of your discussions.
No problem.
Thank you.
What we heard today is that the rule would apply to new buildings and any extensions to existing buildings. So if you have a different view on that, let us know.
Thank you. Thank you for that option.
So, one of the things that, and this is just a general comment, and it's apparent to me from your presentation and the preceding presentation, is that it would be useful if we could get the summary statements out earlier. And that's something I'll take up with Mr. Wesney. It's on a tight time frame already, but I wonder where there's a hearing starting at least on a Monday, whether we might be able to have the hearing statements out on the preceding Friday to assist, if that's possible. And we'll just see whether we can achieve that. But I think there would be some advantages if we could, in terms of giving people advance notice of where there's been some movement by officers. Hey, that was it's also back to your legal counsel, Ms. Gunnell.
Thank you, sir. If there are any other questions from the panel to any of the three of us, then we're of course very happy to answer them. Otherwise, we will leave you to the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Okay, we will adjourn for this afternoon unless there are any procedural matters arising. No, the hearing will reconvene at 9 AM tomorrow morning, same venue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.